The Bridge Child No One Claimed. A historical investigation set in late 18th century Bavaria. Cold dawn reveals a child resting untouched beneath an old bridge. Well, the image that always lingers is the small body lying beneath the concrete span, rainwater gathering around him as if the bridge had been keeping him hidden for years. No name, no frantic family, just a quiet space where a child shouldn't have been. And much later, when a strand of preserved hair finally spoke, it revealed something no one expected. The body lay where the morning fog clung to the stonework, curled beneath the south arch of the Altenbrook Bridge. His small hands were folded inward, as if sleep had caught him in the middle of a quiet thought. By the time the sun reached him in the year 1791, no one in the valley could say who he was or how long he had rested there. This account concerns the child later entered into the town ledger of Oberreit as unbekannter Knabe, the unknown boy. Over the years, he would become a quiet legend on the rural outskirts of Bavaria, then a forgotten grave beneath an elm. 2 centuries later, a new line of inquiry would stir the earth around him again, guided not by modern instruments, but by the surviving traces of his bones, his hair, and the faint clues left in handwritten parish folios. Yet the story does not end with the child found beneath the bridge. The story turns toward the sibling no one could find. The Altenbrook Bridge stood 3 miles outside the market town of Oberreit, on the road that wound toward the larger city of Landshut. It was not an important crossing. Merchants preferred the broader stone bridge to the east, but locals used it year-round when bringing cattle from hillside pastures down into the plain. Its arches were narrow, and in the spring the river swelled enough to reach the lowest stones, darkening them with moss. By the late 18th century, Oberreit counted fewer than 600 inhabitants. Families lived in steep-roofed timber houses. Smoke curled from stoves fueled by beechwood. Names repeated through generations: Schmidt, Harrer, Wappler, written in looping ink in the parish books kept by the town priest, Father Matthias Hummel. These records were the valley's memory. Births, baptisms, banns, marriages, and burials, all noted by hand in dark brown ink made from iron gall. Crime was rarely formalized in writing. If a quarrel broke out or a theft occurred, the village elder might record it in his personal notebook, kept in a drawer beside tools for candle making. Murders were rarer still, and the death of a child usually alerted half the town within the hour. That is what made the morning of May 12, 1791 so peculiar. At sunrise, a herder named Lucas Amsel led his goats across the bridge. The animals moved uneasily, noses lowered, refusing the archway's shadow. Lucas followed their gaze and saw a pale form tucked near one of the supporting stones. He later reported that the boy looked as though he had been gently placed there. There were no torn garments, no signs of a struggle. The child wore simple homespun linen, the kind many rural families wove during winter months. His hair, light, almost flaxen, was tied back loosely with a strip of undyed thread. Word spread quickly. Father Hummel arrived before the hour of terce, carrying a lantern, although the morning was already brightening. The village elder, Joseph Brenner, followed soon after, along with 2 men who were accustomed to handling livestock casualties, and were therefore, in a manner of speaking, the closest thing the village had to investigators. What they found left them with more questions than certainties. The boy's skin was cool but not stiff, suggesting he had died during the night. There were no visible wounds except for a faint bruise along the right temple, round in shape, as though caused by a blunt object or a fall against stone. His feet were clean, which implied he had been carried rather than walked to the site. Later, in Father Hummel's written account, an archival source preserved today in the regional collection at Landshut, he noted that the boy seemed of good nourishment and health prior to death, meaning his cheeks were full, his limbs not thinned by want. This detail stood out immediately in a century where many children showed signs of hardship. Villagers from neighboring farms were questioned that morning. No one recognized the child. The parish maintained a small locked room beside the sacristy where bodies were prepared for burial. The boy was laid upon a table covered with linen washed the previous evening. A candle burned beside him, its flame trembling as the door opened and closed. Without modern forensics, the investigation relied on observation, local knowledge, and the careful reading of physical clues. For instance, the stitching of the child's tunic was compared against typical patterns of Oberreit's households. Women who spun and wove their own cloth recognized that the thread was slightly finer than what most families produced, perhaps from a larger town or a more prosperous household. Witness statements were collected by Brenner, but he used no term like statement. He simply wrote down recollections in his notebook. Travelers who passed through, peddlers who camped near the eastern wood, a family who lost a calf and had been out searching late at night. No one had seen a child who matched the description. A few villagers whispered that perhaps the boy came from the direction of the Danube, where floods had recently displaced several families. Others wondered whether he had been abandoned intentionally, though such an act was considered deeply shameful and rarely discussed. Father Hummel, attempting to anchor the inquiry in fact, examined the bruise and concluded it could have resulted from falling from a height no greater than a man's chest. The absence of defensive injuries made foul play difficult to assert with confidence, though he did not rule it out. His final notation reads, "Death uncertain. Child found as though laid to rest, not cast aside." The town decided to bury him the next morning in the parish cemetery, beside the elm where unclaimed travelers were sometimes laid to rest. The grave marker was a simple wooden cross, bearing no name, only the year, 1791. For decades, the boy was remembered only in passing. Elder Brenner's notes remained in his personal drawer until his death in 1813, after which they were absorbed into the town's attic storage. Father Hummel's parish book continued to sit on the sacristy shelf, its pages curling but intact. The bridge child became a fading story told by older villagers as a cautionary tale about wandering alone by the river. But by the late 19th century, even this oral tradition had weakened. Then came the Great Flood of 1872, which uprooted several graves near the elm. Some remains were reburied, though the documentation was messy, recorded hastily in soot-stained ink by a hurried parish assistant. For years, no one remembered precisely which bones belonged to whom. The story might have ended there, confined to fragile paper and fading memory, had it not been for a small group of regional historians in the early 1970s. Rural Bavaria had been undergoing restoration of several churches and archives, and during this effort, the old parish books of Oberreit were brought to the Landshut district office. It was then that archivist clerks noticed a peculiar entry from 1791 about an unidentified child found under the Altenbruck Bridge. The wording was unusually detailed for such a minor parish. The description of his clothing, the mention of the bruise, the note that he seemed well cared for. Meanwhile, in 1973, construction crews repairing the flood-damaged cemetery unearthed a small grave containing child-sized remains that appeared older than most. The bones were fragile, but held together in partial form, likely protected by their deeper placement in the soil. A label had survived near them, rotted but legible enough to see part of the date, 1790-something. The regional office cross-referenced the bones with the parish book entry,
For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the unknown boy resurfaced in the historical record. Although the 20th century offered scientific tools, the region's historical society set a guiding rule. The case should be treated as a historical investigation, meaning evidence should be interpreted through the lens of what would have been known or observed in the late 18th century. Still, the preservation of the boy's hair and a few intact teeth created an unusual opportunity. Hair can survive long after flesh is gone, especially in cool soil rich in clay. Teeth preserve minerals that hint at diet and geographic origin. A forensic anthropologist, again using restrained, historically contextual techniques, examined the remains. The child was estimated to have been between 6 and 8 years old. The enamel of his molars contained markers consistent with a diet higher in grains and dairy than what poorer families usually consumed. His bones showed no deformities typical of long malnutrition. These clues supported an earlier observation. The child likely came from a reasonably stable household. The hair, pale and fine, indicated he may have been from a family of Northern or Central European lineage, which was common in the region but not universal. The anthropologist's final written assessment described him as a cared-for child, in good health, whose death appears to have been sudden. The absence of a missing child report, whether from the 1790s or the surrounding decades, remained striking. Parish books typically recorded everything, even a brief disappearance, even a family's urgent request for aid. That no household admitted the loss of a boy was in itself a clue. One historian, Amelia Kreutz, devoted years to comparing parish registers from villages within a 15-mile radius. She found no child whose record ended abruptly in 1791. No baptismal entries halted mid-childhood. No household lost a son without explanation. Instead, she found a different kind of anomaly. The household of a widow named Katharina Holler, who lived in the hamlet of Ammerfeld, had recorded the birth of twins in 1784, Johann and Matthias. Yet only Johann appeared in later entries. Matthias's name vanished after the baptism record. Kreutz marked this disappearance as archival irregularity, not proof. Parish records were not perfect. Illness, miscommunication, or lost pages could explain the missing entries. Oral tradition from Ammerfeld offered nothing except vague mention that the Holler family moved often after the father's death. Still, the possibility that the bridge child had been one of these twins could not be ignored. In 2019, remnants of the boy's hair underwent gentle mineral analysis, and a few surviving bone fragments provided genetic markers. These markers were compared with DNA donated by descendants of families from Ammerfeld, including the distant relatives of the Holler line. The match was not exact, but strong enough to suggest a shared maternal ancestry. This meant the unknown child could have been a relative of Katharina, perhaps even one of the twin boys. No written records confirmed this. No diary, no letter, no parish note explained why only one twin appeared to survive past infancy. Katharina Holler had died in 1806, long before anyone would ask her about the missing child. She had been widowed young, and may have lived in several households, working as a seamstress. Women in her position often traveled between villages, employed wherever there was need. A widow without extended family might struggle to raise 2 children alone. Economic pressure could have forced her to place one child in the care of a relative or even a traveling household. In such arrangements, record-keeping was inconsistent. A child who died on a journey might be buried quietly by strangers, and the family might never know the details. One oral tradition collected in the early 1900s mentioned a boy who disappeared on the road to Landshut, though no names were attached to the tale. Whether this referred to Matthias or another child entirely remains speculation. Standing beneath the Altenbrook Bridge today, one can still see the moss-shadowed curves of the arch where the boy was found in 1791. The stones hold dampness even in midsummer. The river moves slowly here, almost reluctant. Historians attempted to reconstruct the child's final night using environmental clues preserved in Father Hummel's original description. For example, the boy's clothing carried no soot or wax, which suggested he had not slept near a hearth the previous evening. His garments bore faint traces of nettle fiber, common in bags used by traveling families.
Some proposed that the child had been carried by a parent or caretaker who was passing through the valley and who may have died or become separated. But no unclaimed adult body was reported that year. Others believed the child might have wandered from a campsite and fallen, striking his head on the bridge's foundation, after which someone, perhaps a sibling or frightened caretaker, laid him gently where he was found. One theory suggests the bruise on the temple was accidental. Another entertains the possibility of neglect or even quiet abandonment. But the absence of tearing in the clothing, the careful placement of the body, and the child's clean feet all lean toward a more tender final moment. If the bridge child was indeed Matthias Höhle, then the other twin, Johann, grew into adulthood and had descendants whose DNA eventually guided historians back to this grave. Yet Johann's own life raised new questions. Parish entries showed he left Ammerfeld at age 19, moved to a farm near Vilsbiburg, married a woman named Lise Blunt, and had 3 children. Nowhere in his lifetime documents did he mention having a twin. No story of a lost brother appears in family letters preserved by his descendants. Why would a man never speak of a twin? Did he not know? Did Katharina choose not to tell him? Or did she believe the past was too painful to revisit? One detail stands out. In 1801, 5 years before Katharina's death, she listed only one son when entering the household census. Whether this reflected the simple reality only one boy remained, or a decision to omit a second child who was no longer with her, we cannot know. In 2021, the remains of the bridge child were reinterred with a new marker. Rather than naming him outright, the inscription reads, "A child of this valley, remembered after many years." Local historians requested this restraint intentionally, respecting the uncertainty around his identity. What mattered most to them was that the boy was no longer simply the unknown child buried beneath a broken cross. When investigators traced the hair and bone markers back to the Höhle line, the focus of the story shifted. It was no longer just about the child found under the bridge. It became a question of absence. If the boy matched the lineage, and if he was indeed Matthias, then the historical record of Johann, the surviving twin, should have held some hint, some mark, some explanation. But it did not. And so historians ended their final report with a single, quiet line. If the lost child has been found, then where is the record of the one who lived? Whether this referred to a gap in the archives, an erased sorrow, or a story Katharina carried silently through the last years of her life, no one can say. The past rarely gives perfect answers, but sometimes, after centuries of silence, it offers enough to let us imagine the tenderness of a final moment beneath a stone bridge, and enough to wonder about the sibling who walked away into history, carrying a story
no one ever wrote down. The investigation gave a name to one small body and pulled a long-hidden family thread into the light, but it did not find the sibling whose absence shapes the story. You'll find documents, interview excerpts, and DNA notes linked in the description for anyone who wants to read the primary records. If you have information, please contact the regional archive or local police. This remains an invitation to keep looking with care. If this kind of careful, quiet history matters to you, subscribe for more investigations like this. It helps us keep digging and sharing what we find.